Los Angeles, January 13th, 1972. The air inside the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church was thick enough to choke a man. It wasn't just the heat of the lights or the bodies packed into the wooden pews. It was the pressure of history waiting to be written. At the center of the altar, a woman sat at a Steinway piano, her eyes closed, beads of sweat tracing the line of her jaw. She took a breath that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the entire room. When her fingers finally struck the first chord of Holy, Holy, the silence didn't just break. It shattered. In the back row, a man who had spent 3 years trying to destroy her reputation dropped his notepad. He didn't pick it up. He couldn't move. By the time the night was over, Aretha Franklin wouldn't just be a singer anymore. She would be the architect of a moment that would force the world to their knees. But to understand why this specific night became a battlefield for her soul, we have to understand the war she was fighting when the cameras weren't rolling. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? 3 weeks earlier, Raymond Vance sat in a plush office in Midtown Manhattan, tapping a gold pen against a stack of vinyl records. Vance was not a musician. He was a critic for one of the most powerful syndicates in America, a man whose typewriter could turn a sold-out tour into a financial wasteland. He was intelligent, sharp, and fundamentally cynical. To Vance, Aretha Franklin was a commercial product, a talented voice wasted on what he called emotional hysteria and simplistic wailing. He had written column after column arguing that the Queen of Soul was a marketing fabrication, a singer with no intellectual depth, directed by men in suits. "She screams," he had told his editor, "but she doesn't lead. She has no vision." Aretha had read every word. She never spoke about it publicly. She never sent angry letters. But those who knew her saw the way her posture stiffened when Vance's name was mentioned. The industry was pushing her to record a pop album, something glossy and radio-friendly to silence the critics. They wanted her to play the game Raymond Vance was critiquing. But Aretha Franklin, a woman who carried the legacy of Detroit and the sorrow of a preacher's daughter in her blood, made a decision that terrified her management. She wasn't going to go pop. She was going back to church. And she was going to invite Raymond Vance to watch. Stay here, keep watching, and subscribe now. The first clash happened 4 days before the recording, inside a rehearsal hall in Watts. The atmosphere was chaotic. James Cleveland, the legendary choir director, was trying to organize the Southern California Community Choir. The acoustics were wrong. The budget was tight. And into this whirlwind walked Raymond Vance, invited by Aretha's press team in a desperate bid to win him over. He stood near the door, arms crossed, wearing a suit that cost more than the choir's entire weekly salary. Aretha was at the piano, working through an arrangement of precious memories. She stopped. Something was wrong with the soprano section. A young girl, no older than 19, was trembling. Her name was Clara. She was a factory worker by day, gifted with a voice of gold, but paralyzed by the presence of the Queen of Soul and the terrifying man in the suit staring at them from the doorway. Clara missed her cue. Once, twice. Vance let out a loud, audible sigh. He turned to the publicist standing next to him. "This is exactly what I mean," he said, his voice carrying over the music. "Amateur hour. You can't build high art on sentimental nostalgia. She's drowning in there." The room went silent. The choir froze. In the music industry, this was the moment where the star usually stormed out or the manager intervened. But Aretha Franklin didn't look at her manager. She slowly took her hands off the keys and swiveled on the piano bench. She didn't look at Vance with anger. She looked at him with a terrifying, regal calm. Then, she stood up and walked over to Clara. She didn't speak to the critic. She turned her back to him completely. She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, leaning in close. "Baby," Aretha said, her voice low and steady, audible only to the first few rows. The man at the door hears notes. You and I? We hear the truth. Don't sing for him. He doesn't have the equipment to receive it. Sing for the empty chair in your living room where your troubles sit. You sing to that. She walked back to the piano. From the top, she commanded. When they hit the chorus, Clara didn't just sing, she soared. The sound was raw, unpolished, and devastatingly real. It was a sound that defied technical critique because it spoke a language of survival. Vance shifted his weight, uncomfortable for the first time. He had expected a diva tantrum. Instead, he had witnessed a master class in leadership. Aretha hadn't fought him. She had rendered him irrelevant by elevating someone else. If you love stories about leadership and resilience, make sure you subscribe for new stories so you don't miss our next deep dive. But the real test was still ahead. The rehearsal was one thing. The live recording at the New Temple Missionary Baptist Church was another beast entirely. The venue was chosen for its feeling, not its comfort. It was a real church in a real neighborhood. There was no air conditioning. The lighting rigs brought in by the film crew raised the temperature to over 90 degrees. On the first night of recording, the tension backstage was palpable. Aretha sat in a small dressing room, staring at herself in the mirror. The weight of the decision was crashing down on her. If this album failed, Vance would be right. The industry would say she had retreated to the past because she couldn't handle the future. She was risking her commercial crown on old hymns. Aretha's father, the famous Reverend C.L. Franklin, was there. Her sisters were there. But in that moment, she was entirely alone. This is the burden of leadership that cameras rarely capture. The solitude of the final decision. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for success, but for strength. She needed to be a vessel. When she walked into the sanctuary, the heat hit her like a physical blow. The pews were packed. And there, in the third row, sat Raymond Vance. He had his notebook open. He looked skeptical, wiping sweat from his forehead with a pristine handkerchief, looking entirely out of place among the congregation of Watts. The concert began. The first few songs were solid, but the energy was nervous. The choir was tight but anxious. Aretha could feel the stiffness in the room. She knew that to make this work, she had to break the wall between performer and observer. She had to dismantle the very barrier Vance used to maintain his cynicism. Then came Amazing Grace. Aretha signaled the band to drop out. She wanted just the piano and the choir. She sat at the keys, playing the opening notes slowly, agonizingly dragging out the tempo. It wasn't a performance, it was a confession. She began to sing. Amazing. Grace. She stretched the word grace until it felt like it contained the entire history of human suffering. She wasn't singing to the crowd anymore. She was singing to the doubt in her own heart, and by extension, the cynicism in Vance's. Halfway through the first verse, a strange sound rippled through the church. It wasn't applause, it was weeping. Grown men were sobbing into their hands. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. And Aretha? She was eyes closed, head thrown back, channeling a power that defied logic. Vance watched, his pen hovering over the paper. He wanted to write that the tempo was too slow. He wanted to critique the phrasing, but his hand wouldn't move. He looked at Clara, the young girl from rehearsal, singing behind Aretha with tears streaming down her face, her voice locked in perfect harmony with the Queen. He saw the connection, the invisible thread of loyalty and shared pain that Aretha had woven through her leadership. She wasn't just a star standing in front of backup singers. She was a general leading her troops through the fire. But the most shocking part was still ahead. As Aretha hit the high climactic note of the song, a sound so pure it felt like it could cut glass, Vance felt his own chest tighten. The intellectual fortress he had built around himself, the walls of irony and critique, began to crack. He wasn't looking at a product. He was looking at a woman stripping herself bare, offering her dignity as a shield for everyone else in the room. He realized then that he had fundamentally misunderstood her. He thought leadership was about control, about intellectualizing the art. Aretha was showing him that leadership was about vulnerability. It was about having the courage to feel deeply in a world that wanted you to be numb. The song ended. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. No clapping, just the sound of 500 people breathing. Then, the church erupted. It wasn't polite applause, it was a release. People stood on pews. Aretha sat at the piano, head bowed, totally spent. If you are finding value in this story of triumph, please subscribe for new stories to help us keep these legends alive. Later that night, the crowd slowly filtered out into the Los Angeles cool air. The equipment was being packed down. Aretha was backstage, toweling off the sweat, looking exhausted but light. There was a knock on the door. It was Clara. She held a newspaper clipping in her hand, one of Vance's old, vicious articles. "Miss Franklin," she said, her voice shaking. "That man, the writer, he's outside. He wants to speak to you." The room went quiet. Her manager stepped forward. "Tell him to get lost. We don't need him tonight." Aretha raised a hand. "No," she said. She stood up, smoothing her caftan. "Let him in." Vance walked in. He looked different. His tie was loosened. The sweat of the church had ruined his suit. He looked human. He held his notebook, but it was closed. "Ms. Franklin," he started, his voice lacking its usual sharp edge. "I came here tonight to write the obituary of your career. I thought you were retreating." Aretha looked at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer him a seat. She waited. "I was wrong," Vance said. It was clearly difficult for him to say. "You didn't retreat. You went to the source. I've spent 20 years writing about music, and I realized tonight I've been writing about the mathematics of sound, not the music itself." He placed the notebook on the table. "I don't know if I can write this review," he admitted, "because what happened in that room, words seem small against it." Aretha smiled then. It wasn't a smile of triumph or, "I told you so." It was the smile of a teacher who finally sees the student understand the lesson. "Mr. Vance," she said softly, "you write what you felt, not what you thought. What you felt. That's the only truth that lasts. The math changes. The feeling is forever." Vance nodded, turned, and walked out. The review that Raymond Vance wrote 2 days later became legendary. It wasn't an analysis. It was an apology to the genre of soul itself. He described Aretha not as a pop star, but as a force of nature that exposes the hollowness of our cynicism. He wrote that in a world of manufactured idols, Aretha Franklin was the stone on which the truth was sharpened. The album recorded those 2 nights, Amazing Grace, went on to become the highest-selling live gospel album of all time. It saved her career, yes. But more importantly, it proved that she was right. She trusted her gut, she protected her people, and she led with her heart. But there is one detail that history often leaves out, a detail that Aretha kept private for years. A few months after the album was released, a package arrived at Aretha's home in Detroit. Inside was a framed copy of Vance's old negative articles, the ones that had hurt her so deeply. But taped over them was a handwritten note from Vance himself. It read, "To the woman who taught me that the mind is a servant to the spirit, thank you for the wake-up call." Aretha hung it in her office, not as a trophy of a defeated enemy, but as a reminder of what her music was actually for. It wasn't to get good reviews. It was to change hearts, even the stony ones. Clara, the young singer. She went on to tour with Aretha for 10 years. She never froze on stage again. When asked why, she always told the story of the rehearsal. "Aretha didn't teach me how to sing," she would say. "She taught me why I sing, and once you know the why, the fear disappears." That is the legacy of Aretha Franklin. We call her the Queen of Soul because of the hits, the furs, the voice. But a queen is a leader. And a leader is someone who can walk into a room full of doubt, hostility, and heat, and through the sheer force of their authenticity turn it into a sanctuary. We often think we need to change who we are to fit the world's expectations. We think we need to please the critics, the Raymond Vances of our lives. But Aretha showed us the opposite. She showed us that when you strip away the artifice and go back to your core, back to your own amazing grace, that is when you become undeniable. Hit like, subscribe, and drop your comment before you hear the final twist. Years later, when Aretha Franklin passed away, they found a small notebook on her piano. It was filled with set lists, grocery lists, and prayer requests. But on the very last page, scribbled in her handwriting, was a quote she had seemingly carried with her since that sweltering night in 1972. It wasn't a Bible verse. It was a line from the review Raymond Vance had written, the man who had once been her greatest detractor. She does not ask for your attention. She commands your respect by giving you her soul. She had kept it not because it flattered her, but because it was the moment she knew she had won the only war that mattered. The war for her own voice. Until next time, remember that your greatest strength isn't what the critics say you have. It's what you can give when the lights are hot and the pressure is on. Before you go, subscribe for new stories and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own power today. Respect yourself, and the world will follow.